I never thought I would be the kind of man who waits in the parking lot of a Hilton Garden Inn with a Starbucks cup sweating in my hand, staring at the flickering neon that spelled vacancy like some cruel neon prophecy. My name is Mark Turner. I am 42. I live in Austin, Texas. I drive a Ford F-150 with a lift kit and mud tires. I grill like it is an Olympic sport. And I have spent the last 15 years building a life with my wife, Jessica. We have 2 kids, a golden retriever named Buster, and a suburban house that smells faintly of pine cleaner and leftover bacon grease. I had always believed, in that quietly smug American way, that if you worked hard, provided, and loved, life would reward you with loyalty. That was before I discovered that loyalty is often just a concept tossed aside in the dust of betrayal. My cheating wife was about to prove it. It started small. Jessica had begun leaving her phone face down on the kitchen counter, ignoring my questions about late nights at the office. She stopped coming to Sunday family brunches with her mother, she laughed at my jokes less, and she started wearing clothes I did not recognize, clothes that seemed designed to attract more than casual attention. I am a man who notices details, not because I am paranoid, but because I have always been attentive. Something was off. Something was dangerously off, and I could not shake the feeling that the universe was conspiring to reveal the truth to me in the most painful and theatrical way possible. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but then again, intuition is often the only warning system left when infidelity creeps into family life, like smoke into a perfectly sealed house. The first time I saw her, I could not believe my eyes. Jessica was standing on the balcony of a third-floor hotel room, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her laughter piercing like the song of a siren designed to tempt sailors into shipwreck. She was not alone. There was another man, a man I recognized immediately from a work event. Someone with a tailored suit, a charming smile, and the audacity to smile back at my wife the way she had not looked at me in years. The betrayal hit me like a semi-truck in the dead of night. I felt my chest tighten, my knees weaken, my Ford F-150's engine idling uselessly in the lot below. I had to make sure this was not a hallucination, a cruel twist of fate, or the result of too much caffeine. I adjusted the dash cam, checked the GPS coordinates, and confirmed the hotel address. Reality is stubborn like that. My cheating wife, the woman I had trusted with my heart, was betraying me in real time, and the world seemed suddenly quiet except for the echo of her laughter. What followed was a sequence of events that no screenwriter in Hollywood would dare script, because it was too improbable. I watched from behind the hedge like some amateur detective, the family dog safely locked in the F-150, because I could not risk leaving Buster at home alone in case Jessica returned early. Every small movement, every whispered word, every touch was captured in my mind with a clarity that both horrified and fascinated me. It was as if the world had split into 2 parallel universes, one where I believed in love and family, and another, darker one, where infidelity was the only constant. Where betrayal was a currency exchanged in whispers and stolen glances. And then she saw me. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened in shock, and for a moment, I thought she would run, scream, or throw herself into some dramatic escape. Instead, she did something I did not expect. She blamed me. She said that I had failed to satisfy her, that I had been too predictable, too safe, too unimaginative, and that this other man simply gave her what she had been craving all along. The audacity of it struck me dumb. My mind screamed. The betrayal was now compounded by a surreal inversion of guilt, a parody of reality where I was the villain in my own life. I had to sit down in the Jeep Cherokee rental car I had commandeered for surveillance. I could feel my family life dissolving in front of my eyes. The betrayal was not only emotional, it was a violation of trust so profound that it made every dinner, every laugh, every whispered goodnight feel like a lie that had been rehearsed for years. I thought about the children. I thought about the future. I thought about how American culture glorifies the nuclear family, how the ideal suburban life is often a facade, how infidelity lurks in the shadows of every office and bar, waiting to pounce when you least expect it. And yet, there was also something absurdly cinematic about the scene. A man in a lifted F-150 hiding behind a hedge, watching the woman he loves laugh in the arms of another, the neon lights reflecting off her hair, the faint scent of hotel soap carried on the wind. It felt like an exaggerated version of life, like life itself had decided to parody my pain. I began to formulate a plan, although at the time, I did not know it was a plan. It was more a mental exercise, a way to cope with the surreal nightmare unfolding before me. I considered following her into the hotel room, confronting her and her lover, and unleashing a torrent of words so scathing that it would echo through the Hilton halls for decades. I imagined hiring a private investigator, compiling photographic evidence, sending anonymous letters, staging a revelation at Thanksgiving dinner that would leave her mother fainting on the dining room rug. Each scenario played in my mind like a parody of revenge, a cinematic version of justice where I, Mark Turner, the betrayed husband, would rise above the infidelity with a mixture of cleverness, theatricality, and righteous anger. It was absurd, yes, but it was necessary. Absurdity was the only way to survive the betrayal without collapsing entirely. By the time she left the hotel, slipping into her car with the lover in tow, I realized that I had crossed a threshold. The line between reality and fantasy had blurred. I knew that my next actions would determine whether this would be another sad story of suburban betrayal or a saga of cunning and personal triumph. I thought about how betrayal in American culture is often romanticized, how infidelity stories populate magazine covers and reality television, and how we, the unsuspecting victims, are forced into roles we never auditioned for. My cheating wife had inadvertently cast me as the protagonist in a story that I would control from this moment forward. The shock of discovery had transformed into a narrative possibility, a conspiracy of opportunity that demanded action, not despair. I drove home in silence, the dashboard lights painting my face in shades of guilt, rage, and anticipation. The suburban streets of Austin passed by like a blur, the familiar sights of Starbucks, the local high school, and the barbecue joint where I had spent Saturday afternoons with Jessica now felt alien, almost mocking. The betrayal had rewritten the rules. Family dinners, school pickups, bedtime stories, all these routines had been infiltrated by the presence of infidelity, the knowledge that my life had been shared with someone capable of deception so elegant, so meticulous, that it left me questioning every memory. Yet beneath the devastation, a spark ignited, the spark of determination, of strategy, of reclaiming my story from the chaos she had created. I realized then that this was not just about betrayal. It was about reclaiming identity, agency, and a sense of justice that could only be delivered through cleverness, not confrontation. By the time I parked in the driveway, Buster wagging his tail as if nothing had changed, I had constructed in my mind a map of actions, a timeline, and a narrative that would turn this infidelity into a series of moves I could control. My cheating wife had forced my hand, and in doing so, she had inadvertently provided the theater, the props, and the dramatic tension I would need to rewrite our story. The betrayal had been the first act. The coming days, weeks, and months would be the second, where the suburban parody of infidelity would intersect with real consequences, revelations, and a degree of poetic justice that Hollywood itself could not have scripted. In that moment, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The cheating wife may have won the night, but the story, the true story, had only just begun. And I, Mark Turner, would be the author, director, and lead actor of the chapters yet to come. I woke up the next morning to the faint glow of sunlight spilling through the blinds, and the smell of over-roasted coffee drifting from the kitchen. Buster was already at my feet, tail wagging, a silent reminder that life, for all its betrayals, kept moving forward. I stared at the empty side of the bed where Jessica usually lay, her hair tangled in familiar chaos, and I felt a chill, the kind that creeps along your spine when reality refuses to soften its blow. The events of the night before replayed in my mind like a corrupted movie reel, each frame more grotesque, each detail more humiliating. The betrayal of a cheating wife is not just an act, it is a psychological weapon, and I had been its target without even realizing it. I did what any man steeped in the American ethos of self-reliance and quiet pride would do. I made a plan. But first, I allowed myself the luxury of despair, a controlled indulgence of self-pity that lasted exactly 47 minutes. I poured a fresh cup of dark roast, the kind that burns your tongue but wakes your senses, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had already started compiling screenshots, text messages, photographs, and timestamps. I had even considered renting a drone to capture further evidence, the absurdity of which made me smirk despite my simmering anger. my cheating wife had no idea the magnitude of the storm she had unleashed. Infidelity, I realized, is often a game of hubris. The betrayer assumes they are invisible, untouchable, while the betrayed silently architects an intricate web of consequences. As I scrolled through the digital remnants of her betrayal, I felt the paradoxical pull of rage and admiration. Rage because she had violated our family, our promises, our routine dinners and bedtime stories, and admiration because the level of theatrical commitment to her deception was almost impressive in its meticulousness. I could not decide if I should cry, scream, or laugh, so I did all three at once, a cacophony of emotion that left Buster tilting his head like a confused co-pilot on a flight to hell. It was during this symphony of inner turmoil that I began to realize something profound. The absurdity of the situation itself was a weapon. Life had handed me a plot that was simultaneously tragic and farcical, and my response would determine which genre it ultimately became. By late morning, I had decided that passive suffering was beneath me. I was an American man, a father, a provider, and I would not allow my identity to be subverted by the infidelity of a cheating wife. I began methodically cataloging every transgression. Every flirtatious emoji, every late-night phone call, every unexplained absence was meticulously logged into a spreadsheet I had designed to resemble a law enforcement investigation. I even color-coded the entries: red for acts of infidelity, yellow for suspicious behavior, and blue for the moments where the betrayal intersected most directly with family disruption. It was obsessive, yes, but necessary. Justice, I decided, required not only courage, but documentation. I considered sending the spreadsheet to her, but then imagined the melodramatic response she would give, a mixture of denial, indignation, and the audacity to blame me yet again. I laughed at the thought, a sharp, bitter laugh, because humor is the coping mechanism of those who navigate betrayal with their sanity intact. The next day, I executed my first reconnaissance outside the digital world. I parked outside her yoga class, a location I had observed before, noting the time, the flow of traffic, and the comings and goings of her friends. She entered the studio with a group of women who looked like they had stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, all smiles and Pilates mats, oblivious to the unfolding drama in my life. I hid behind the wheel of the F-150, sipping another cup of coffee, marveling at the way betrayal distorts perception. Suddenly, the studio door opened, and she emerged with a tall man who could have been a bodybuilder or a model. I could not tell which. They exchanged a hug that was far too intimate for the public eye, and I felt the old familiar stab of infidelity once again. But this time, I was armed with perspective. I watched, cataloged, and imagined the absurd ways in which this scene could be broadcast at Thanksgiving dinner, the ultimate theatrical payoff of American family revenge. Back home, I began to draft what I called the Family Infidelity Playbook. It was part satire, part fantasy, and wholly therapeutic. I imagined secret cameras in the kitchen, dramatic confrontations in the living room, and whispered revelations at church events. Every potential scenario was exaggerated to the point of parody. Jessica being trapped in a conversation with her mother while I casually displayed evidence on an iPad, the children innocently asking why Aunt Karen was shocked, the neighbor, Mr. Jacobs, fainting in disbelief. I laughed aloud, the sound echoing in the empty house, because fantasy, in moments of betrayal, is often the only refuge. I realized that revenge, when orchestrated like a theatrical production, becomes less about vengeance and more about narrative control, about reclaiming the dignity and agency that infidelity had temporarily stolen. I spent the afternoon contacting a private investigator I had once read about in a business magazine. The agent, a sharp woman named Veronica with a taste for trench coats and conspiracy theories, promised to provide additional photographic evidence. She suggested creative tactics, drone surveillance, strategic stakeouts, and even embedding GPS trackers in innocuous objects like gym bags or laptops. I felt a thrill, a combination of fear and exhilaration, as though I were stepping into a secret society where the betrayed gain powers denied to ordinary citizens. The absurdity of the situation did not escape me. I, a mild-mannered suburban dad, was now orchestrating a campaign worthy of a Hollywood heist, with my cheating wife as both antagonist and unwitting participant. That night, I drafted letters that would eventually be delivered to key figures in our lives: family, friends, even a few professional contacts. I imagined the look on her mother's face, the subtle shock of neighbors, the quiet ripple of awareness spreading through our social circle. The letters were written with precision, alternating between cold, factual recounting of events and exaggerated, almost fantastical reflections on betrayal and the perils of misplaced trust. I smiled as I signed the first envelope, thinking about the irony of life. Betrayal had transformed me from a passive participant into the playwright of my own destiny. My cheating wife had set the stage, and I, for the first time, felt fully in control. By the time I went to bed, exhaustion had replaced adrenaline, and Buster lay curled at my feet, a small anchor in a storm of infidelity and absurdity. I reflected on the day's events, the emotional roller coaster, the careful collection of evidence, the flights of parody and fantasy that had sustained my sanity. I realized that while betrayal wounds deeply, it also reveals character, resilience, and ingenuity. My cheating wife had ignited a chain reaction that would reshape family dynamics, social interactions, and perhaps even the very narrative of our lives. Infidelity had entered our world like a thief, but I, Mark Turner, would be the one to script the final act, and the family, our shared and fractured family, would witness a tale of cunning, revelation, and the indomitable power of reclaiming agency. The morning of the reveal began with the kind of tension that feels like static in the air, the house humming with the anticipatory quiet before a storm. I had spent the previous night orchestrating a plan so meticulous it could have been a scene from a Hollywood screenplay or a particularly dark episode of a reality TV series. I called it Operation Exposure, a moniker that sounded far more dramatic than the suburban dinner party that would serve as its stage. Jessica had no idea what was coming. My cheating wife, whose hubris had always exceeded her judgment, wandered through the kitchen oblivious, her hair perfectly tousled, lipstick a shade too bright, as though preparing for a date with destiny rather than a reckoning with reality. The children were at school, Buster was asleep in the corner, and I had set up my devices like a command center for psychological warfare. Cameras were hidden strategically, one in the flower vase, another behind the bookshelf, and a third camouflaged in a framed family photograph. My laptop pinged softly, connected to the remote feeds, each screen showing Jessica moving through the house, unaware that her every gesture was being documented for posterity. I had enlisted Veronica, the private investigator, to provide a live feed of her movements outside the house as well, because betrayal, I had decided, must be both documented and theatrical. The absurdity of this scenario did not escape me. A cheating wife had unwittingly turned our home into a set for a parody thriller, and I was the director. By noon, Jessica received the first of my carefully crafted coincidental emails, supposedly from friends and family, innocuous at first, questioning subtle details. Why had she been late to book club? Why were there receipts from the local coffee chain with an unfamiliar man's name? Why had she been photographed leaving the yoga studio with someone else? Her face went pale as she read each one, the realization slowly creeping in that the digital breadcrumbs she had left behind were now tracing her straight into a trap of her own making. I watched her from the laptop, every micro-expression amplified by my excitement and rage. Betrayal is a funny thing. It magnifies every detail, and infidelity magnifies it further, turning even a small deception into a narrative of monumental proportions. By early afternoon, I had prepared the pièce de résistance, a slideshow of images, texts, and screenshots projected onto the living room wall, accompanied by a voiceover I had recorded in my most dramatic theatrical tone. The voice, mine but amplified with gravitas, recounted the timeline of her betrayals, each incident punctuated with moments of parody, exaggerated captions, cartoonish thought bubbles, and absurd speculation about her intentions. The cheating wife of our story, of course, was oblivious to the impending performance, moving through the house with a mixture of self-satisfaction and unconscious guilt, her infidelity, now the central narrative of my revenge theater. The moment of confrontation arrived when I called her mother, family friends, and a few neighbors, under the guise of a casual gathering. They arrived one by one, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to bewildered horror as the living room lights dimmed and the slideshow began. The voiceover recounted each betrayal with the precision of a forensic report, but the flourish of a satirical narrator, painting Jessica as both villain and comic figure. Every intimate text, every suspicious photograph, Every meeting that violated the sanctity of our family life was displayed, dissected, and narrated. The absurdity of the situation, the way infidelity had turned domestic life into a theater of exposure, was not lost on me, and I allowed myself a grin, savoring the irony. Jessica stood frozen, the weight of her actions reflected in the faces of the family members who had come to witness the spectacle. Her cheating wife persona, once so confident, now faltered under the scrutiny of her own consequences. I had anticipated denial, protest, and attempts at gaslighting, and she delivered each with comedic timing that would have impressed any screenwriter. Her words, accusations, and attempts to shift blame were met with calm, factual rebuttals, each backed by time-stamped evidence, a catalog of betrayal so meticulous that it bordered on the absurdly obsessive. Infidelity, I realized, is only as powerful as the secrets that sustain it. Once exposed, it becomes a weapon turned against the bearer. Amidst the chaos, I introduced a fantastical element, a parody of her own deceit. Using a series of puppets, one representing her, another representing her mysterious yoga companion, I enacted a miniature reenactment of the most egregious betrayals. The neighbors gasped, some laughed, some shook their heads in disbelief. It was a surreal moment, a fusion of comedy and revenge, and yet, underneath the parody lay the sharp truth of infidelity, the fracture of family trust, and the moral reckoning that she had inadvertently orchestrated. Betrayal, in all its forms, is a narrative device. The cheating wife had written her own script, and I was merely performing the climax. As the evening progressed, I allowed the theatricality to give way to sober reflection. Jessica, her composure shattered, attempted to explain, to justify, to plead, but the narrative had shifted irreversibly. Family members, witnesses to the evidence, whispered among themselves, their reactions a mixture of empathy for my position and astonishment at her audacity. I watched, my emotions a turbulent mix of satisfaction, grief, and lingering affection, the complex blend that accompanies any profound betrayal. Infidelity, after all, is rarely a black and white affair. It carries the weight of unmet expectations, miscommunications, and the unpredictable chaos of human desire. The final act was a speech I had written earlier that day, delivered in my calmest, most deliberate tone. I spoke not with malice, but with clarity, delineating the breach of trust, the disruption to family life, and the consequences that inevitably followed. Jessica, the cheating wife, listened silently, her expressions oscillating between disbelief, shame, and begrudging acknowledgement. The family, our extended circle of neighbors and friends, absorbed the narrative with a mixture of sympathy and astonishment. By the end, the room felt transformed. The betrayal had been laid bare, the infidelity exposed, and the power dynamics shifted. I had reclaimed agency, directed the narrative, and turned what could have been a private humiliation into a public reckoning. As the guests departed, leaving behind murmurs of awe and whispered judgments, I sat back with Buster, the loyal companion who had witnessed every stage of this domestic theater. The cheating wife, stripped of pretension, wandered to the kitchen, her face pale, her movements hesitant. I realized that the act of exposure, though parodied and dramatized, had accomplished its purpose. Betrayal had been confronted, infidelity made tangible, and family dynamics altered irreversibly. Yet amidst the parody, conspiracy, and theatricality, a lesson crystallized. Revenge, when executed with precision, creativity, and a touch of satire, does not merely punish. It clarifies, instructs, and reshapes reality in a manner both cathartic and transformative. By the time night fell, the house was quiet, a stark contrast to the theatrical storm that had raged earlier. I reflected on the surreal sequence of events, the transformation of domestic space into a stage, and the reclamation of power from a cheating wife whose hubris had blinded her. The infidelity, once a secret gnawing at the edges of family life, had become a public narrative, dissected, dramatized, and ultimately tamed. Betrayal had been met with strategy, family trust had been defended, and the parody of exposure had served as a lens through which reality, absurd as it sometimes is, could be interpreted, endured, and ultimately understood. The morning after the theatrical exposure, the house was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next act. I walked through the living room, past the scattered remnants of my Operation Exposure. The puppets lay crumpled on the carpet, The projector still hummed softly, and my laptop screensaver blinked like a ghostly sentinel. Buster followed me, tail wagging hesitantly, sensing the lingering tension. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee before her, her eyes hollow, her posture defeated. The cheating wife who had once moved through our home with the confidence of someone untouchable now seemed diminished, caught in a surreal mixture of shame, anger, and disbelief. Infidelity had left its mark, but so had exposure, parody, and meticulous orchestration. I had already anticipated this morning, rehearsed it in my mind while orchestrating the public reveal, and yet nothing could fully prepare me for the intensity of her gaze. It was a mixture of apology and accusation, an unspoken question that hovered between us. Why did you go so far? Betrayal, as I realized, has a lingering echo that cannot be fully silenced by confrontation alone. Family trust, once fractured, takes time, patience, and deliberate effort to rebuild, if it can ever be rebuilt at all. I sat across from her, the air thick with the unsaid, the absurdity of the previous day's events still lingering like smoke. Jessica's voice finally broke the silence. She spoke with a trembling clarity, trying to explain her actions, blaming a combination of unmet needs, fantasies, and misguided expectations. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, eyes darting toward the laptop, the projector, and the scattered puppets. She paused, a shiver running down her spine as if the weight of her infidelity pressed upon her physically. She blamed me, predictably, suggesting that my failures to satisfy her emotionally and physically had created a vacuum she sought to fill elsewhere. Her words, a toxic cocktail of deflection and guilt, could have reignited anger, but by now I had reached a different stage in the emotional journey. Betrayal had transformed from a wound into a lens through which I understood not just her actions, but the entire web of family dynamics, desires, and human folly. Instead of fury, I felt an odd mix of pity and resolve. I had crafted a narrative that exposed her infidelity, turned it into parody, and confronted family and community. I had reclaimed agency, and the balance of power had shifted. Yet the path ahead required more than vengeance. It demanded wisdom. I began to outline a series of steps, not for revenge, but for clarity and, if possible, closure. The first was communication, honest and unflinching. The second was boundaries, carefully defined to protect both family integrity and personal dignity. The third was an acknowledgement of the absurdity that life had handed us, a recognition that parody, fantasy, and theatricality were sometimes necessary to survive betrayal without succumbing to it. Over the next few days, we engaged in a series of structured conversations, facilitated by a counselor who had experience with family trauma and infidelity. The sessions were surreal at first, Jessica recounting her escapades in exaggerated detail, my responses alternating between solemnity and sarcasm. The counselor occasionally raising an eyebrow as the narrative spiraled into parody, fantasy, and conspiracy-like speculation. Yet through the chaos, something remarkable began to emerge. The act of structured exposure, the theater of revenge, had cleared the air. Confessions flowed more freely, apologies became less performative, and the weight of unspoken betrayal began to lift. Infidelity, once a sharp, cutting blade, was transforming into a story with lessons, however bitter. As part of my strategy, I introduced a symbolic ritual, the Cheating Wife Chronicle. Each week, Jessica and I would document moments of honesty, transparency, and contrition, juxtaposed with reminders of prior betrayals, creating a tangible archive of growth and consequence. The process was almost absurdly meticulous, a blend of fantasy and parody, yet it provided structure and accountability. It reminded us that family, though strained, could survive the tremors of betrayal if managed with deliberate care and dramatic, sometimes humorous, honesty. Then came the twist, one I had not fully anticipated, but now embraced with cautious amusement. During a visit to the grocery store, a neighbor approached, whispering about a local rumor that my revenge theater had been observed from afar and was circulating online. Apparently, a passerby had filmed part of the puppet reenactment and uploaded it to a local forum, complete with captions mocking the absurdity of domestic infidelity. The footage went viral in the small town, prompting a mixture of laughter, sympathy, and judgment. Jessica, the cheating wife, blushed deeply at the public attention, while I felt a strange combination of vindication and disbelief. Infidelity had become performance art, and reality itself had embraced parody as a mechanism of social justice. By the following month, family routines resumed with cautious normalcy. Jessica, though still humbled by public scrutiny, engaged in acts of transparency, rebuilding trust brick by brick. I, meanwhile, continued to navigate the delicate balance of revenge, parody, and fantasy, occasionally indulging in the absurd notion that our domestic life had become the subject of a surrealist sitcom directed by life itself. Betrayal had been confronted, infidelity exposed, and the family, though scarred, had emerged more aware, more communicative, and, oddly enough, more resilient. I often reflect on those weeks of chaos and theatrical confrontation with a sense of wonder. The cheating wife who had disrupted family harmony had inadvertently catalyzed a journey of revelation, satire, and strategic reclamation of agency. Life, with its absurd twists and dark humor, had provided a canvas on which to transform personal betrayal into narrative control, a lesson in both creativity and resilience. The house, once a stage for exposure, now became a laboratory for rebuilding, for examining human folly, and for embracing the paradoxes of family life. Ultimately, the experience reshaped my understanding of betrayal. Cheating, once a purely destructive force, became a catalyst for self-discovery, for dramatic creativity, and for the recognition that parody and fantasy can coexist with the most painful realities. My cheating wife remained a complex figure in this narrative, a source of conflict, laughter, and occasional despair, yet also a participant in the reconstruction of family trust. Infidelity, exposure, and revenge had converged to create a story that was uniquely ours, a tale of betrayal transformed into strategy, parody, and eventual understanding. As I sit at the same kitchen table where the saga began, Buster at my feet, the morning sun illuminating the remnants of projector light on the walls, I feel a cautious peace. Jessica, once my betrayer, now walks through the home with a tentative respect for the consequences of her actions. Family life continues, imbued with a mix of caution, humor, and restored trust. The story of betrayal, infidelity, and the cheating wife has become more than a private wound. It is a testament to the human capacity for resilience, the transformative power of exposure, and the strange, sometimes comedic journey from humiliation to reclamation. And so the house breathes again, infused with the lingering echoes of parody, conspiracy, and theatrical revenge, but also with a sense of hard-earned equilibrium. The narrative, once dominated by a cheating wife and the chaos of infidelity, now folds into a broader story of family, strategy, and the enduring capacity to navigate betrayal with creativity, intelligence, and, when necessary, a healthy dose of theatrical absurdity.